in our field, the why, the what, the where, and it's being presented by our esteemed colleague from the North in Nova Scotia, Canada, Robert S. Wright, MSW, RSW. Today's webinar is a little different than usual. We're proud to announce that we're collaborating with MESOC and MATSA to bring you this webinar. And I'd like to tell you how that came about. Here at NERI Press, we have long identified the importance of training in our field on working with competence and humility with clients from a range of cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds, and with clients who are racially diverse. We planned this year's webinar series with this in mind, and we invited Robert Wright and Alejandro Leguizamo in January to present on this very topic. At the same time, the MESOC and MATSA Board of Directors had also decided to make cultural competence the theme of their upcoming 20th anniversary conference in April 2018. So they approached us to work with them in conducting webinars on cultural competence for our field in preparation for their conference. What a wonderful synchronicity it's been. And so NERI Press and Training Center and MESOC and MATSA are co-presenting today's webinar. I'll let today's host for MESOC, Joan Tabachnik, and most of you know she's also the former director of NERI Press and Training Center. I'll let Joan tell you more about all of this shortly. Before I turn things over to Joan, though, I want to take a moment to tell you about NERI Press. Our mission is to share cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. For many years, we accomplished that mission only through book sales, but with changes in the last several years in the publishing and technology worlds, we've expanded our mission of knowledge dissemination through new means. Over the last 5 years, NERI Press has offered online courses, a free monthly research to practice newsletter, in-person trainings, and these webinars delivered by our internationally recognized authors and other experts in the field. Just out of curiosity, how many people have participated in a NERI Press webinar before? Tim, can you launch that poll, please? So I'm seeing that we have a lot of newbies. That's great. 58% of folks have not attended a NERI webinar before, 42% have, 41%, 59% no. So more than half of you are new to the NERI webinar series. Welcome, we're very excited to have you. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. I'll talk more about this at the end, but if you find these webinars helpful, we do hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of our webinar series. Not unlike NPR and other public services, it's your donations that help us make this series happen. So I'd like to suggest that you consider becoming a sponsor of this webinar series. Being a sponsor guarantees you a seat for every webinar in the series, and we will not only register you and 15 staff members of your organization for each webinar, but we can also offer you a gift of 2 NERI Press books. It's your support that allows us to continue to bring you these free resources. We so appreciate our communication with you. I want to tell you that that's one of the most important things to us at NERI Press and Training Center. The last thing I'll say before handing this over to Joan is that here at NERI Press and Training Center, we'd like to get your suggestions, input, and feedback, whether positive or negative. So please don't hesitate to contact us with your questions, critiques, or suggestions. And now I will hand it over to Joan. Thanks, Joan, for being here.
Hi, now can you hear me now?
We can.
I'm hoping so. Anyway, okay, thank you, Tim. So anyway, thank you so much to NERI and to NERI Press, particularly for for this partnership and this opportunity for MESOC and MATSA to focus attention on the topic of cultural competency when addressing young people who engage in or are victims of sexual harm, as well as adults. For those who don't know, MESOC is an organization, the professionals committed to stopping sexual abuse through the early and specialized intervention assessment, and treatment and management in the lives of sexually abusive children and youth. This is also sponsored by MATSA, and MATSA is a chapter of a national organization called ATSA, which is the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. And why are we just focusing on this today and on this topic? And just as Lisa mentioned, the theme for our 2018 MASOC-MATSA conference is in Marlborough, Massachusetts, and it's threading this theme through our entire conference. And you can see from our the website on the screen. If you want to find out more information, you can go to either of those websites. And we also hope that you will consider presenting at our conference. We have our call for presenters out right now, which is due on October 15th. And as you may know, that there's a wealth of literature indicating that when general mental health treatment is culturally competent or tailored to the cultural specific needs of the individual and families, the result is a better treatment outcome. And this is no less true for the case of specialized mental health treatment services, such as those aimed at addressing harmful sexual behaviors. Effectively treating and managing risk while also focusing on rehabilitation in the context of strength-based approaches are routinely highlighted as top priorities. And is our position that the effective treatment of harmful sexual behaviors must be both research-based as well as culturally competent. So in this 1 hour webinar, which we are going to blast through with Robert, that we are introducing the foundations, the foundational elements of cultural competency. And Tina Adams was the first person from MASOC to reach out to Robert, and but she's unable to be here, so I had the distinct pleasure and privilege of introducing Mr. Robert Wright as our presenter to share his expertise in this area. And Mr. Wright comes with a wealth of knowledge and experience. He's, as Lisa mentioned, he's a social worker and a sociologist whose 28-year career has spanned the fields of education, child welfare, forensic, mental health, trauma, sexual violence, and cultural competence. He has served in notable roles in those sectors in Nova Scotia. Currently, he's a private practitioner, and as a practitioner, he coordinates the Halifax Pro Bono Counseling Clinic, which conducts Man Talk, a treatment support group for male victims of sexual violence, and consults, trains, and teaches and comments on a wide range of issues. His pioneering work with colleagues in cultural competency and forensic cultural assessments has received national attention. So really it is with a great pleasure that I have a chance to meet, to introduce Robert. And without further delay, I'm turning this over to you, Robert. So welcome. And Robert, if you're speaking, you may want to hit the unmute so that we can hear you.
No, I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes, I can hear you. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Very good. So I am just going to share my screen and my webcam so that people can see my slides and my person. So just to make sure that both of those things have happened, can someone just give me a thumbs up or let me know that it's happened?
All good.
Yes.
All good. Excellent. Excellent. Well, I won't spend a lot of my time in introductions or preliminaries. I just say I'm happy to be here with you all, and happy for the short commute to NERI Press in presenting this webinar today. So I have just prepared a few slides here. You already have an introduction of me, but I always like to share this slide because I love that picture of myself. How's that for... So let's talk about cultural competence. As we begin this work, I think it's important for us to remember that cultural competence is really not that new. It's kind of like the new brain research. We've been at it for a couple of decades already, but certainly its importance and is being stressed increasingly with every passing year. Here in Nova Scotia, concerns about cultural competence are ubiquitous in healthcare, in education, in justice, in the public service. in all sectors now, there is an increasing recognition that cultural competence is an important thing for us to be doing in order to ensure that our services are relevant and effective for all peoples within our population. It's interesting that here in Nova Scotia, in just the last few years, in our public service, the management performance measures have actually been adjusted such that cultural competence is now a competency that is expected of managers within the civil service. Here in Nova Scotia, we've had a lot of history that helps us to see the need for cultural competence. In 1989, there was a significant case of an inquiry into the wrongful conviction of Donald Marshall Jr., who was a Mi'kmaq individual who, as a youth, was convicted of a murder that he did not commit. And the inquiry, quite boldly and quite bravely, I think, when they studied the rationale for his wrongful conviction, they established quite clearly that racism and discrimination exist in the criminal justice system and were the main reasons for his wrongful conviction. And that resulted in 82 recommendations that was reforming the entire criminal justice system here, from police service delivery to prosecutors to defense attorneys to the courts and the bench itself. So we've seen the cultural competence in that context. Certainly, in terms of criminal justice, I share this headline that I read some time ago, a few months ago, when a Superior Court judge in Massachusetts ruled that a black man fleeing from the police is not a suspicious act, and that, in fact, such an action would be reasonable. I think the court said that given the nature of police and African American interaction, that it is a reasonable thing for a black person to simply wish to escape the indignity that comes from police interaction. So when those kinds of things are being said, certainly it's going to be important for us to understand how better to serve people from racialized or minority populations. When we think about cultural competence in sexual violence, we need to recognize that people who are racialized are overrepresented both as victims and perpetrators of adjudicated offenders. This is something that we certainly have seen both in terms of criminal justice statistics and child welfare statistics right across North America. There's also an importance to acknowledge that there is a unique socio and cultural and historical construction of violence and sex for all populations. So if we are in the violence and sex business, as we are as treatment professionals and others who are involved with sexual violence, we need to understand that not all peoples come to these topics with the same historical and cultural perspectives. And then, of course, there's a need for competence and service delivery for our clients. Just some more thoughts on that topic in terms of cultural competence. One of the things I do like to say is that we're not involved in thinking about cultural competence because North America is increasingly diverse. North America, since early colonial times, has always been diverse. Aboriginal peoples here, of course, were in North America before European arrivals, but when the Europeans came, they came with tremendous diversity. And so our concern about cultural competence at this particular time is more related to the fact that racialized Aboriginal and immigrant, I say Canadians, but North Americans, are beginning to gain space in society. And they're demanding respect and competent engagement. So these are some of the reasons why we want to spend some time thinking about cultural competence. I'm not going to read the whole slide, but the content is there so that when you download the material, you'll be able to read a little further. I want to go right into the definition of cultural competence. Now, I should explain that the definition of cultural competence that you'll see here comprises 5 essential capacities or skills. And this is a definition that I've been working on for probably the last 20, I hesitate to say, 20 plus years. So, you'll see shortly that some of the work that I do borrows quite heavily from the work of Edwin Nichols, who's based in, he's an industrial organizational psychologist who's based in Washington, D.C. And you'll see that shortly. So, cultural competence, 5 essential capacities. The first is that we must understand our own cultural position and how they differ from and are similar to others. I think it was Darold Wing Su and I'm not sure of the first name of the other author, but it was Su and Su who wrote the classic text Counseling the Culturally Different. And one of the things that they said is that our capacity to provide competent service to an individual is enhanced the closer we are together in terms of our cultural similarity. So the closer we are, the easier it is for us to work together. The further apart we are, the harder it is. And so recognizing that we actually have a cultural location that will create the barrier that we have to then overcome in reaching our clients is an important thing to recognize. And I think that that's probably harder for people who have lived in the without a racialized or immigrant experience to comprehend than it is for those of us who are racially visible or immigrant. So that's the first capacity. The second is we need to understand the social and cultural realities in which we live and work. So I always say that we might work in the same city, but we often live in different worlds from our clients. The third is we need to cultivate appropriate attitudes, which is, as they say, a no-brainer, and you'll see it's a no-brainer when we get to that slide. And we need to be able to generate and interpret a wide variety of verbal and nonverbal responses. So that's the cultural hermeneutics, the ability to talk across and about culture. And finally, this fifth capacity is one that has been a part of my work only in the last probably 8 or 9 years. I've come to recognize that there is no cultural competence unless there is an awareness and a commitment to social justice. So those are the 5 capacities. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to give you a quick run through of these different capacities, and then towards the end of our time I will try to make an application of some of this to some of the work that I've been doing around black male sexual victimization, which is something that I presented on at the MASOC MATSA conference in the spring of the year. So, again, thinking about Ed Nichols, Ed Nichols approaches this work from a very well-informed location, and after decades and decades of studying, Ed has said that he's able to describe well how the ancient historical cultures, continental cultures, how they emerged from their unique history and their unique climate and the structure of their governance. So he traces the history of their development and then compares them in terms of axiology, epistemology, and reason. For the purposes of this discussion, I will show you the chart that Ed has prepared, and I will warn you before I show it to you that it is very full. It demonstrates really the complexity of understanding cultural difference. Yeah. Just to put your mind at ease, I always confess that I have been working with this material since 1988, and I have a thorough and competent grasp of about 2/3 of it. So just in case you think that cultural competence is way over your head, be comforted. It's over all of our heads. The goal is really to increase our cultural competence. None of us are going to cross a finish line and be culturally competent. So just to look at Ed's chart for a moment, you can see here where he talks about differences in axiology or values, epistemology, or ways of knowing, and then on the right-hand side there you see his look at reason, both in terms of logic and process. I won't go through this too closely because it's just too much content, but if you just focus on the idea of values, the premise here is that different people have different values, and that ethnoculturally speaking, the values that we have may very well be shaped by our ethnocultural location and may have resonances of our ancient and historical cultural origin. So, for example, people of European descent may have may express more that value of objectivity and acquisition or pursuit of objective. Whereas, for example, African or African American peoples may have a much higher member orientation, where relationship is a higher value. Now, not to pigeonhole all white people and all black people into these separate locations, but it does have an expression that these cultural differences do have expressions in education, for example, where we're always talking about the difference between high context learners, or learners for whom relationship is significant, and low context learners, those for whom relationship is less important. And how one delivers curriculum and how students engage is different among those two different types of learners. And as we've come to see, that learning style is influenced by our ethnocultural backgrounds. So, to move on, we also need to understand something about the social, cultural, and historical context. And I always say that North American diversity is fraught with our complicated and tragic history. We can think of the enslavement of Africans, the attempted genocide of First Nations, and the global strife that results in transglobal immigration. We are living daily the consequences of our complex history. And certainly in North America, where there's been a lot of talk lately about the removal of, if we think about the removal of monuments from public spaces and parks, for example, where some people are saying, well, that's just a reflection of our history and culture, and others are saying, well, those are real artifacts of our racist history. So we can see that we as I say, we might all work in the same city, but we come from different worlds. In terms of cultivating appropriate attitudes, this is a pretty simple one. In a nation that acknowledges multiple founding peoples and that was built up on the foundation of ethnic and immigrant labor, and whose future depends on immigration, an attitude that is an open and welcoming attitude and an attitude of respect and acceptance is probably the only one that is reasonable in North America. In terms of communicating across cultures and communicating about cultures, I like to quote Elmer Hollenstein, who was a sociologist, I think a linguist, an anthropological linguist, or something like that. And he uses this phrase. This is his quote: "Before meaningless, unnatural, non-human, or immature behavior and corresponding values are attributed to people of another culture, it is better to begin by doubting the adequacy of one's own judgment and knowledge." Essentially what Hollenstein is saying is, you need to understand me and who I am before you can understand what I'm saying. What we sometimes call cultural hermeneutics. I like to paraphrase Hollenstein by saying this: before you conclude that I'm crazy, you should consider the possibility that you're stupid. This is a kind of a lighthearted way of saying that when we are with our clients and we don't seem to be able to make sense of them, it's a pretty good practice to sit and reflect on what may be missing from my knowledge set that is complicating this communication, rather than coming to the conclusion that your clients are just not reasonable. The final part of the definition that I use is around the need to understand structural oppression. It is true that we live in different cultural realities, and that sometimes our cultural location influences the way we seek help and the kinds of things that need to be done in order to help us. But I think the jury is out on the fact that most health inequities among different peoples in North America are directly attributable to historical and continuing racism and oppression. So though cultural difference might explain some complications in communication, it's the structural oppression that really contributes to the health inequities. And so the practitioner who would be culturally competent must have an understanding of structural oppression, and I believe in order to be engaging and authentic with a diversity of clients, must demonstrate a project or program of active participation in the work to address and redress that social oppression. In other words, every practitioner must be an activist. So now, if a little time permits, I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that I did for Masok Matsa in the spring. So this is just a way of thinking about how do we apply cultural competence when it comes to our service delivery to clients. And so I'll just explain that for quite a number of years, I have been working on, I've been doing a work around the issue of black male sexual victimization. The work begins as I approach that population. One of the things that I say to my colleagues is that when we're going to begin to do complex clinical work with people of African descent, we need to appreciate that in North America, the social and cultural and historical location of African Americans largely begin with the European trade triangle, or the transatlantic slave trade, if you will. And that some of the things that continue to exist in the experience of people of African descent has its origins in that history. And when we think of black male sexual victimization, there are some things that we perhaps overlook or aren't quite informed about related to the experience of black men who were enslaved. I think we have a better handle on the nature of the abuses that black women suffered through slavery, and I think probably that's we're most aware of that because when black women were sexually victimized, often there was biracial offspring that was the evidence of that. And there's a lot of literature around those kinds of things, and how the black female body has been a tool in the survival strategies of the black community. But black men weren't free of sexual victimization through that period of enslavement. There was, in fact, an actual slave trade in black male bodies, essentially a sex slave trade in which black men were sold for sexual purposes. Of course, we all know that male genitalia there was the target of much abuse during this period of time. Male genital torture and mutilation is very well documented in the period of enslavement. In fact, one of the things we know right through enslavement and even into Reconstruction is that when it came to lynching, it was hardly a black man was lynched without having their genitals tortured and mutilated. So I won't get into all of this. The slides are there. You can see it. And there is a reference of an article that goes into this in some depth. So again, just thinking back about our cultural competence and understanding of the socio-cultural and historical location of persons is important. After slavery, of course, the history of black male sexual victimization continued, and I think that most people will recognize the picture here of Atticus Finch representing a victim in the story To Kill a Mockingbird, and we'll remember that the person in that film was being tried due to allegations that he'd committed a sexual offense against his alleged victim. And as the thing emerges, of course, we come to find out that the man was the victim of the advance and not the perpetrator. In more modern times, we have seen in the media black bodies eroticized and fetishized. Having a significant background in child welfare, I've certainly studied the higher incidence of child abuse in black families, higher incidence of black youth, and in particular black male youth, of being in care and incarcerated. And we know that is true both for youth and adults. And it's interesting, we think about the dramatic overrepresentation of black men in correctional institutions, and we also talk about the prevalence of sexual abuse in oppressive institutions, both prisons and other institutions. But we never think about then black male sexual victimization. I also talk a little bit about the hip-hop framing of male sexuality, and although we won't do it here in this webinar, I've left in the slides a link to a YouTube video in which that is a documentary on the life of this, the person depicted here is Lil Wayne. Or I guess it's technically Lil, L-I-L Wayne, who is a hip-hop rap artist. Lil Wayne was sexually abused when he was 12 years old, and he tells the story of how he was in the home of his mentor in the rap business, and how, as a 12-year-old young man traveling with men in that circle, he was sexually assaulted in the presence of a room full of adults, when those adults told a 15-year-old girl in the room to perform oral sex on him. And he's telling this story to his own child musical protege, suggesting to that child that it's time for him to be sexually active. Again, these abuses aren't even described, although Lil Wayne will say that he acknowledges he was raped. He also says how he enjoyed that experience. So if we think about cultural competence, and we think about applying cultural competence to particular populations, then I would just encourage you to incorporate cultural competence into your practice. And so I've just left this final slide here in terms of how do we incorporate cultural competence into our presentations, into our teaching, into our work. Well, the first thing I suggest to people is just ask about sociocultural and ethnocultural location. As a therapist, on my intake form, I ask, how do you identify in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture? I also ask, how do you identify in terms of sex, gender, and sexual orientation? These are questions that are just a part of the dialogue that I have with my clients. The introductory dialogue, in fact. And some people will ask, well, how do you ask those questions? And my short answer to that question is always a little cheeky. You ask with your mouth. And as a dear friend of mine, an Acadian who had lost his language, who reclaimed it after much effort, he said, everyone can learn to speak a second language. You just have to be willing to speak it poorly for 7 years. So I just encourage people to start asking about the sociocultural, ethnocultural location of your clients. We can also research incidents, experiences, and attitudes of sex and sexual abuse within our various ethnocultural communities. There is an increasing literature. And if you just Google the population, the demographic that you're working with, and sexual abuse or sexual offense or victimization, I'm sure that you'll find an article that will help you to be able to apply what you are learning in terms of cultural competence to the particular group that you're working with. And finally, add an example or case study that demonstrates intersections of gender, race, and ethnocultural backgrounds when you're teaching, when you're working with clients. You'd be surprised how that simple act goes a long way to helping clients understand that you are informed and an ally in the work of providing more competent and services to people of cultural backgrounds. So that is the presentation. And I look forward to your questions. Now I guess we're just waiting for Joan to join us for Q&A.
Robert, this is Elisa, and
Yes.
I think, Joan, we're not actually able to hear you, I think because you're on the phone, if you can hear me. It works better if you use the your computer's microphone. So Robert, one of the questions, I will take over
Sure.
for Joan until we can hear her. One of the questions that came in is, can you tell us about the concept of cultural humility and how it informs the role of therapists in working with their clients?
Well, in terms of this concept of cultural humility, I think it really is that first piece that I talk about, and that is that clients or therapists need to have an awareness of their own sociocultural location and the fact that that differs from their clients. And we need to appreciate then that we're used to our culture, our location, being the filter through which we engage in the world and see everything. And when we are working with a client, really any client, it's really important for us to work really hard to remove our cultural filter and adopt our client's filter so that we can see their world through their cultural location. So whether you call it, cultural humility or that kind of this cultural awareness, I suppose a harder language for people who are of European descent, a harder language might be, really acknowledging white privilege when working with ethnoculturally different clients. Yeah.
Joan, are you with us now? Still can't hear Joan. Okay. So, Robert, maybe you could say a little bit more about the concept of white privilege. That's not something that I heard you talk about too much in your presentation, but I think it's very key to any discussion that we have when a therapist is white and they're working with a person of color.
Yes.
What else can you tell us about that, the role of white privilege in the relationship between client and clinician?
Yes. Well, I'd say this, that white privilege, well, let me back up and say that it is likely that most therapists are coming to their work from somewhat of a position of privilege. We're all educated, we're all relatively middle class, or if not yet on our way to it. But there is a very unique, white privilege is a very unique privilege because essentially what white privilege is it's a recognition that because of the history of North America, people of European descent have received benefit from the historical location, their historical location as descendants and kin to the colonizers. And that people who are Aboriginal, people who are of African descent, really are in a disadvantaged location historically because they are the descendants and the affiliates of those who were oppressed. And so white privilege is a very unique form of privilege that in order to properly engage with people of Aboriginal and African descent and other ethnocultural groups, a white therapist really needs to be aware of that. For one reason, it's because that the black client, the Latino client, the Aboriginal client will not necessarily immediately identify you and attribute to you the role of helper and healer, right? And so you'll have to overcome that initial suspicion, the reasonable suspicion that you will not understand them and that you not only don't understand them, but may not be able to help them, and worse yet, may even hurt them. And that's why I say in cultural competence, it's really critical that the clinician have a clear understanding of structural oppression, which includes a clear understanding of white privilege, and has a demonstrable history of engagement in the struggle.
Thank you, Robert. Joan, are you there now?
I don't know. Can you hear me? I guess
Yes.
is the question.
Yes.
Oh, finally. Wonderful. Thank you for jumping in, Elisa. And there's actually quite a few questions coming in, Robert. And one of the questions is in your experience, like, what's the best way to train field workers to understand these concepts? And is there a way, particularly maybe, to practice these concepts, in preparation within some sort of training environment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a strong believer that the best way to learn these concepts. I mean, I've just done a webinar on cultural competence, and you should have attended this webinar. That's the first thing. But I think that we need practice laboratories for this stuff. And one of the things that I say to people is that if you're building cultural competence, then you need to have clinicians in your who are allies to you, with whom you can practice your cultural competence so that you can have a safe place to ask questions. So I'm a strong believer in that sense around mentoring. So I encourage people who, I'm a clinician. I've always paid an individual to do a clinical supervision with me as a private practitioner. Well, if I wanted to increase my skill on REMDR, then I would go to a seminar, I would pay to go to the seminar, and I would probably hook up with a clinician who's well skilled in that area and consult with them very regularly. Right? I encourage people to do the same thing around cultural competence.
That's great, thank you. And also, if people would like to hear more from Robert, this is an unbiased plug for coming to the MESOC MATSA conference, where Robert will be doing a presentation as well this year. So that's coming up in April of 2018 from the 11th through the 13th. I'm wondering if you could talk, you at one point you had mentioned, I wrote this down as well, that's really important for you to be an advocate for your clients. And I'm wondering, particularly as I think about this field where people sometimes are afraid of being labeled defenders, but also it's important to be an advocate. And I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to some of that, particularly in this cultural competency lens.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. As a forensic clinician, I do a lot of assessments. I do parental capacity assessments, often when there is a hint of sexual abuse. And I do a new thing we call cultural impact assessments. When a person has been adjudicated of a crime, I'll do an assessment to help the court understand where how their ethnocultural background may have played a role in their offense. And I often say that one of the things that clinicians are often afraid of is they're often afraid of being too much of an activist, such that they will be perceived by the courts that they testify in front of as somehow biased. Right? So, and then you disqualify yourself in advance because you're not working with proper kinds of objectivity. And I think that is a too simple understanding of the concept of bias and prejudice, right? So when I'm asked about my biases and prejudices, I say, yeah, I'm biased, you know. So, for example, I live in a society that says adults shouldn't have sex with children. That's one of my biases, right? And there's an awful lot of science that talks about the health inequities that are suffered by people who are racialized in North America. And as a practitioner, I have an ethical obligation to work to remedy those inequities. And that's not an issue of bias. That's simply, following the science. Yeah.
Right. This is a brave question too, but would you say that as a novice counselor, acknowledging a lack of knowledge about a client's cultural background can assist in forming a greater alliance in which they view your efforts to learn about being what is being genuine? I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that, particularly for a new clinician who is learning so much about this field as well as about cultural competency.
Absolutely. I think that's spot on, as they say. I think that acknowledgement starts with acknowledging that there's a difference. Right? So the client comes in and sits down, and you begin the work, and you're going through your intake, and you say, well, look, one of the things that I'm noticing here is this: I'm a black man, and you're a white woman. And I'm just wondering, how is that going to play out in our helping relationship? And because I've never been a white woman, I may need to check in with you to see whether or not, or just how, your experiences as a white woman is influencing the issues that we're talking about in therapy. Right? Because I don't want to make the assumption again, remember, I see the world through my ethnocultural filter. So I don't want to make the assumption that I'm seeing this situation the same way you are. And so that's why I open up the dialogue early about the fact that we're in different locations. So that if you think I'm not understanding you, or if I'm not feeling like I can understand you, I'm going to come back and check in with that, okay? And that often is like a key that unlocks a very important room in our therapy work with clients, because they should not be the person responsible for acknowledging elephants in the room, right? The therapist really needs to take that responsibility, and whether you don't need to necessarily know anything about that client's location, but you need to know that they have one and that it's likely different than yours. And so opening up the dialogue about that difference is the very beginning of cultural competence.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think especially given, if you think about the silence around this issue in particular, what that means in terms of opening up the silence around cultural issues as well. Yes. As a therapist. Yes. It seems to have a certain resonance here in this work. I'm wondering, just that one of the other questions actually that I have is just that you've talked a lot about structural oppressions, and I definitely sort of understand that from the a cultural and what's happening historically. I think as you really well outlined that. I'm wondering if there are some particular structural oppressions in the work that we do that we should be aware of, that might be inherent in our field as social work, for social workers or for people who are doing assessment or treatment or management of someone with a sexual offense.
Well, sure. Well, I think that we need to recognize that racialized people in our field are overrepresented among those who are adjudicated for sexual offenses, right? And they're underrepresented among those individuals who are reporting sexual offenses, right? So we have this tremendous imbalance in our field, right? we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that racialized people, blacks, Latinos, Aboriginal peoples, are known to be more frequently subjected to these kinds of offenses, and yet are less likely to report these? And I think that that is directly related to the fact that people from those locations do not trust the systems that they would report to be able to address their needs. We know that in this field generally, it's tough for victims to report, and victims' treatment can be less than kind. All the more so when the victim is a racialized or Aboriginal person, right? So I think we need to recognize that. We also need to recognize that racialized people are dramatically overrepresented among those who are adjudicated for these crimes, sex crimes that we you know, that is the cornerstone of our work, and that's true both in terms of adolescents as well as adults.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I know that because of time, I wanted to have a chance to both thank you, but also turn this back over to Elisa, and so she can do some closing. But Robert, this has been incredibly wonderful, and I know there's a few questions we have not been able to answer, so I would just encourage people who have other questions. You see Robert's contact information up there, so please, email, or you can contact NERI Press. And I encourage you all to think about attending the MESOC-MATSA conference and learn more about these important issues.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Robert.
You're very welcome. It was a very short time, but I hope people found it was useful.
Yeah. Now back over to you, Elisa. And hopefully, Lisa, you're unmuted as well.
Yes, thank you, Joan.
Great.
I want to thank you both so much, Joan, for approaching us for MESOC and MATSA, but to you, Robert, for such an incredible webinar and conversation. I so appreciate all of the learning that we did here today, and I look forward to seeing you in April at the MATSA MESOC conference. I wanted to let everyone on the call know that our CE process recently changed. Paid CE credits will be available for psychologists and social workers for this webinar. For details about how to obtain those CE credits, please visit neripress.org. I also wanted to remind you all that NERI Press and Training Center also publishes a free monthly newsletter in which we discuss a new or controversial journal article or research paper and examine its implications for clinicians and the field. It also shares news and information about NERI's trainings, new books that we've published, and sometimes even a public policy update. You're automatically signed up for this resource, and we hope that you will find it useful. Please, please consider becoming a sponsor for this 2017-18 webinar series that will run on a monthly basis through June 2018. We have a really exciting slate of webinars for the new season, driven by feedback that you, our audience, provided over the last couple of years about the topics that you feel would be most useful to you. When you sign up to be a sponsor, as our thank you to you, we send you 2 of NERI Press's popular titles. You're guaranteed a seat, or for an organization, up to 15 seats in each webinar throughout the series. We'll publicize your sponsorship in all of our webinar materials and during the webinar, and we'll also do your monthly registration for you. Sponsorship is $98 for individuals and $250 for organizations. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please contact us directly or by email or phone. And I would like to thank our wonderful sponsors so far. We hope more of you will join us. You can see them here on the screen. They are both organizations and agencies and individuals. And we really, truly would not be able to hold these webinars and keep them free without our sponsors' support. Thank you so much again to MESOC and MATSA for this partnership, and to you, Robert, for such a great webinar. A huge thank you to all of you for attending. If you like this webinar, you can see previous webinars on our website at nearypress.org and on Neary Press's YouTube channel. It's possible to pay for CE credits for all past recorded webinars. And in closing, I'd just like to say again how much we welcome your feedback, so please be sure to complete your evaluation form when you close out the webinar or contact us via our website. Thank you all so much for being here.